right, welcome to another week in Studies in Proverbs. Today we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 3, and I've entitled this Following Wisdom in Relationship with God and Others. Once again, as we look at the first four verses of Proverbs, we see that uh, once again the picture is of a father instructing a son to seek wisdom. And the reason to seek wisdom is in order to bring life and prosperity. Wisdom is also in these verses connected with love and faithfulness, which is key. And this will come up later in the chapter as well. Wisdom is also likened to being kept around your neck and written on your heart. In this case, the item being around the neck is not so much one to adorn as more something valuable to be protected. So you can imagine keeping a key around your neck, and having it written in your heart, of course, protects it secure. And wisdom leads to a good name with God and others. And if you remember in Luke, this verse is referenced in the growing up of Jesus, that he gained favor with God and human beings. So the next section is verses 5 to 12, and that's an exhortation to be faithful, that we're to trust in the Lord with all of our heart rather than our own understanding. And what is said next goes along with it, that we're not to be wise in our own eyes, but to be humble. So we're to acknowledge the fact that we do not understand everything, and when the time comes, rather than merely trusting our own knowledge, we need to rely on God and his knowledge. The next part of the Proverbs, it talks about tithing, actually, giving your first fruits to God. And this again relates to humility. It's an acknowledgement that everything we have comes from God, but also God's faithfulness, that as we are faithful to God, he is faithful to us. And then the next part of the passage talks about when things don't go the way we expect. And we're to see this not as God punishing us, but rather discipline. He's training us to be better followers of him. Most clearly, this is an opportunity for faith when we don't understand, going back to earlier in the chapter. And when things don't make sense, and the general rule of Proverbs that those who are wise and those who follow God will be blessed, this particular verse speaks to when things don't go the way we expect, and how that's when we have the opportunity to continue to acknowledge God and to submit ourselves to his will in our lives. Go from there to verses 13 to 18, we see wisdom depicted as a woman. First of all, we have repeated, and Proverbs does a lot of this repetition in order for these truths to sink down into us, that we are to see wisdom as more valuable than silver, gold, or even precious rubies. It's the highest good earthly desire that we can have, because in following wisdom, we are led to both life on the one hand and blessing on the other. Her ways are pleasant and peaceful, and taking hold of these ways leads to blessing. And then in verses 19 and 20, there's just two parallel verses that really talk about how wisdom is part of the created order. that by wisdom God created the earth, which is the foundation of creation, and the heavens, and that's the highest part of the creation. So, from the lowest depths to the highest heights, God has created this universe in a way that is wise, in a way that is filled with wisdom. He divided the deeps, which is the waters of the earth, with the clouds, which are the waters above the earth, and the dew, which is the water on the earth, or rain. In all of these words, creation is informed by wisdom. And I use the word words here because God spoke. If we go back to the first chapters of Genesis, God spoke the universe into being. Um, the predominant view in our world today is that um, the world evolved by random chance. And while evolution is certainly real to a point, we can see that the universe is not a result of blind indifference, but rather creative purposefulness. And that's perfectly reflected in the Genesis account of God speaking and the world coming into being. Or John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Um, this idea of God speaking and the world being made, um, Jesus as the eternal Word, the eternal wisdom of God, all of these things are indirectly alluded to here. The other thing is that, yeah, this is repeated here, that wisdom betrays, creation reveals wisdom. And I think any honest look at the world around us, and we can see that it is not a result of random occurrences, but is rather the work of a mind, the mind of the Lord. In verses 21 to 26, we see that wisdom gives life and protects, returning again to the image of wisdom, gracing our person like a beautiful ornament around our neck. It gives peace to us as we walk, live, and sleep. It protects us from disaster. Why? Because in it we see that the Lord is our confidence and protection. We are not merely slaves to our circumstances, but we are entrusting our lives to the God of wisdom. And we are, since we are living in the way that He has called us to, we can have confidence that He will bless us and protect us. So, um, when we come to verses 23 to 31, we get into some specific don'ts of living in community. And they are: don't withhold good from one who deserves it. Don't put off helping your neighbor. Don't plot against your neighbor. Don't wrongfully accuse, and don't envy the violent or follow their example. And the first number of examples, these are ways in which we are to treat our neighbor. And they are framed, all of them framed in the don't. And it's an interesting psychological fact that um, free will is really free don't. In other words, they've done studies and found that it's impossible for human beings to not be tempted, that images and things come to us, ideas come to us that are beyond our control. But our response to them is in our control. And so that's why many of the commands in Scripture are given as don'ts. Because while we may be tempted to withhold a good from someone who deserves it, we are called instead to react differently. And so we will not do that. And one of the principles that we see here is that good demands a response from us. Following the way of wisdom is not merely not doing bad things, but rather it is doing good things. And more specifically, it is responding properly to the good around us. And also, as the last phrase says, because it says, do not envy the violent or follow their example, it's also a proper response to evil, that we are not to embrace evil, that we are not to follow the example of evil. And then when we come to the last few verses, in verses 32 to 35, we see the contrast between the wicked and the righteous. God detests the wicked and but in contrast to that, takes the righteous into his confidence. In other words, his friends. He mocks mockers, but gives grace to the humble. In other words, those who are proud, um, God will respond in the same way to them. But to those who are humble themselves, God is gracious. And finally, and kind of to conclude this chapter, we see that God honors the wise, but the fools ultimately will come to shame. So this whole chapter here is really focusing on wisdom and our relationship to God and others. So that's it for this week. Take care.